All right. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for taking time out of your day today to join us for this webinar. Pleased to be joined by my two colleagues, Mark Bowlby and Anjana Bose, who will be joining me in this presentation, speaking to all aspects of planning to how you can accelerate your time to drug submission. So we've broken up the presentation today into three parts. I'll be speaking to the high-level overall planning. It's critical that you start long before submission to have a chance to achieve a faster time to submission once you get to that final database lock. Anjana Bose will be speaking to planning for the period that runs from the time of database lock through final TFL delivery. And then Mark Bowlby will be speaking to planning for that period from that TFL delivery through to approval of documents, and lastly onto full submission. So again, I'll be speaking to the high-level planning up front. Then Anjana will speak to database lock to TFL delivery, aspects of planning that are needed to make that as fast as possible. And then Mark will speak to planning for the phase that runs from TFL delivery to approved documents and then on to submission. So one key point here is that I've had great fortune in my career to be involved in a lot of submissions and to play an integral role in a lot of them. And Mark and Anjana have as well. And we want to share with you the key concept that you don't go faster going from database lock to submission by holding lockdowns and working weekends and holidays. And those things may end up being necessary, but you go faster during that period by planning up front. And there are a lot of experiences that we will be sharing with you today to try to convey what we've learned on these aspects. All right, so what's behind all of this? So why are we needing to go faster? So there's obviously the companies need to see a return on investment. There's a lot of dollars, a lot of time, a lot of resource that's gone into bringing a drug through development to the time of submission. And that often includes promises to shareholders of a submission date that you'll have to work back from. So there's a lot of pressures and reasons for wanting to make this process as fast as possible. Ultimately, the key is delivering for patients. When you get the product out onto the market, then it's available, and we want to get that product available to patients as early as possible when there's an unmet need there. So as I mentioned at the beginning, without planning up front, you won't go faster in that database lock to submission time period. So one of the things that people often shy away from is working out detailed timelines. And I know early in my career, I was working with what I consider to be one of the best submission teams I ever worked with. They had put together and I'd worked with them on a detailed timeline that had timing of all activities down to the day. And we were about 8 months out from submission. And I was talking to the clinical lead on that project, and we were going over the details of the timeline. And I commented how there was a staggering of the summary documents towards the end, and there was 2 or 3 days of kind of flexibility there that, if something needed to shift a day or two, we could do that without impacting the timing at all. And was very surprised to get a blank look back. They just looked at me and they said, well, why would we do that? And I had never heard of that concept before. And the reality is we went through that entire 8 months of submission, kept everything to the day, nothing shifted, and people were not working nights and weekends. I think For me, that was a key insight into what's actually possible. There's a lot of things that have to be in place to make that work. The team has to function very well. The team needs to be experienced in submissions, and there has to be top-down management support. So there were a lot of good things in place that allowed that to happen and made it possible for the team. But the key point is that it is possible. You can do it. You can set up a detailed timeline well in advance and stick to it. So what are some of the components and the things that we'll be speaking to specifically today? So in the graph at the bottom, you'll see that we have this divided up similar to how we're presenting today on the component that's planning for database lock through delivery of draft TFLs. Those activities are driven by data management, statistics, and programming. Then the next one in blue is the work of writers, functional SMEs, regulatory, and management in authoring, reviewing, and approving all of the documents. And then lastly, regulatory affairs and regulatory operations, delivering the content plan and all the publishing leading up to the actual eventual submission. The key thing with this graph is that notice that they're not only happening during that final period, they're happening long beforehand, ideally 12 to 18 months before a major submission, and they all overlap. So they're all going on at the same time, and that's essential. So there's some key things that you ought to be keeping in mind and trying to address as early on in your submission planning as possible. So is your submission date unmovable? Typically it is. It's been promised to shareholders. If not, consider yourself fortunate and build out a plan that allows the time that you need for the activities. Do you have that top-down support from management, identifying the critical path and exactly which items are truly rate limiting? Is your submission a priority, or will your team be distracted by other activities? This is a common thing, and it's a lot better to confront that, figure out how you're going to deal with it along the way, than to try to pretend that that's not the case. And then a key point that we'll all be speaking to is getting as much done as you possibly can prior to database lock. So anything that is not data dependent, to have it completed prior to that last database lock. So one of the things we've done recently is we work with, Synchrogenix work with a lot of different submissions with a lot of different companies, and we've pulled together a little database of, here's 15 major NDA, BLA, or MAA submissions we've been involved in the last few years, and looked at the timing of those key steps from database lock out to submission. You'll see that across these 15 submissions, the mean is just under 3 months, around 164, 165 days, but run from 67 days all the way up to almost an entire year. We broke this down into these 3 stages, kind of database lock to draft TFLs. Generally across these was 2 to 3 weeks. The draft TFLs to getting that last document approved was running more on the order of around 4 months, 129 days, so obviously the bulk of the time. And then that time from last document approved to submission, similar to database lock to draft TFLs, was running in that 2 to 3 week time range. So you see I have a red box around the bottom 3, the 3 fastest submissions. They all have one thing in common. They were being driven by the rate limiting activity was a final data cut for a phase 3 study for which most of the data had already been cleaned and locked and available, or it was a phase 1 study like a thorough QT or drug-drug interaction that still had to be included in an important way in the submission, but was the rate limiting step. So one of the first things to look for in your submission is, of course, that critical path and what's rate limiting. If you have one of these submissions where your primary phase 3 study is not the driver of the submission and not rate limiting, and instead is one of these final data cuts or a phase 1 study, you definitely have the potential to go a lot faster. All right, so some key messages. Holding your kickoff meeting and engaging senior management as early as possible, typically 12 to 18 months for a large submission, 12 to 18 months before your planned targeted submission date. Do build your timeline out, both to build in as much detail as possible so that you've accounted for all the activities, but also ensuring that you're completing everything that's not data dependent as early as possible, and establish a meeting schedule and a communication plan and stick to it. All right, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anjana, who will be speaking to you about that database lock to TFL delivery period.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. And I will be covering the phase from database lock to final output. So, and primarily I'll be concentrating on the work that can be done or that to be done in the period 12 to 18 month period that Steve mentioned before database lock. So where do we start? As with everything, we start with a timeline, a task list, listing, really making a detailed list of all the tasks, especially factoring in the interdependencies. Like if we have, 1 to 5 to do number 5, what else do we need to complete before we can get to number 5? And also identify the overlaps, especially most of the time, as you all know, there are multiple studies in a submission, right? So it is critical to also pay attention to the different studies, and especially if any of them are running in parallel, to make sure that adequate resources are planned and one study, progress on one is not going to compromise the other. So once we have the timeline, the next thing to think about is all the different functional areas. This is really, who will be doing what, and who will be responsible for everything. So in this period, also think about, it's not just the internal folks, also the external folks, because nowadays, most of the organizations, it's really data management is happening in one place, programming is happening in one place. So we need to make sure that we are factoring in all the key components, key areas that will be involved in this period, in this process. And as with everything, we also need to set up plan for periodic team meetings. And this is primarily to make sure that it is progressing as planned, as desired. And if there are anything that needs to be corrected, any mitigation steps to be implemented. And last bit is having a good communication plan. We all can do what we need to do if we know what we have to do and when we have to do, so we can really put the pieces together. So really install plan, and plan with the end in mind. Next slide, please. Now I would like to spend a few minutes on the role of different functional areas in this process, and especially as we all think, when we think of data log, we think it's really a data management thing. But in my experience working on many submissions in Synchrogenix, the different programs we have worked on, as well as in my previous life, it's really more than data management, because there are other functional areas that play a key role in this process. So it is really critical to engage at all these different functional areas. For example, programming team, they are not only doing the analysis programming for analysis tables and all that, they're also very, very helpful to program edit checks. And what I mean by that is cross checks, checks against, checks across different CRF pages, basically. It's not variables within a page, it's across pages, which is easier to program in SAS or other packages rather than manual checks. And as example, and also graphical plots, these are very, very helpful. I'm sure many of you have experienced this because outliers, they are easy to spot in figures when we do have a plot instead of going through listings page after page, and especially lab data. If there is a study that is happening in multiple sites in many countries across many regions, outliers with lab data is very common due to use of different units and other things. So that's where the scatter plots are extremely helpful in my experience to spot those outliers and take corrective action upfront. Then, there is also the stat team. They are also working side by side along with programming as well as data management. They are the one that sets the rules for derived variables, the SAS codes for analysis, as per SAP, as well as, the other piece, probably many of you are already utilizing this piece, right? Creating independent validation checks for key outputs, especially primary efficacy and secondary efficacy, which form really core, and they depend, they vary from study to study or depending on the therapeutic area. In addition to data management, programming, statistics, the other groups that also play a key role are clinical, medical, as well as medical writing. Clinical team, as we all know, are very, they are in direct touch with study sites as well as clinical operations. And especially as patients are enrolled in the study, are they really meeting the eligibility criteria? How they're doing, identifying protocol violations, protocol deviations, to figure out if it's really happening in a specific site, or is it something to do with protocol that will require some protocol amendment. So it's really helpful to engage the clinical team in this data cleaning process. Also medical, as we know, medical team, they review the safety data. So getting that input ahead of time and upfront really helps in my experience. They are also very helpful to review the coding. And by coding, it's the coding of adverse events, coding of medications, those things. And more we do it on an ongoing basis, it helps to really, root out the inconsistencies and findings, because we don't want to see it after the database log or after the final tables. We want to really figure them out beforehand, so we can really, accelerate the time from log to final output. Last group that most of the time I feel are left out is the medical writing team. Medical writing team, it's really, this team is the one who is putting those final tables, making the interpretations and putting them in the summary documents. So as quickly as we can engage them, and if we can involve this team in the data cleaning process, it helps them, it helps everybody, it helps the writers as well to connect with the data tables. What is where and what is going from, how do I take this table to the report, that connection, as well as to make sure that all must-have analysis are really covered. So to sum it up, it's not really the size of the program or the complexity of the program. It's really teamwork and working together and putting all the heads together that makes a huge difference. Next one, please. So this is just to give you a quick example. This was a program with about 3 studies and 300 to 400 patients per study. It took about 16 to 18 months to complete. Where I thought it really helped the team for this particular program, they really came together and worked together and put their heads together, and programming team was instrumental in running test runs, programming and executing the test runs, along with help from data management and statistics, with 1/3, 2/3, and finally with 100% clean data. And the good thing about doing that last test run is really the last check on the database to making sure that all data corrections have been implemented. There are no other inconsistencies, nothing we are overlooking. So once the database gets locked, it's ready. It doesn't have to be unlocked again. So bottom line is what it helped from the time to database lock to take, we got the top line results in 3 days post lock. And other thing is even getting the full final TFLs, tables, figures, and listings, it was just 3 weeks. And it was a large program and there was additional analysis. It was not because not everything panned out as expected. Next one, please. So a few, I want to now dive into what else can be done, what else can we do before. Two other things to think about is also additional analysis. SAP and everything, it sets a set of planned analysis, but it's also good to think about what if scenarios. So what else do we need to think about? What else do we need to pay attention? And what can be done, this new to meet additional requests? Either it can come from FDA or it can come from, management review because we all probably have encountered situations where at the late stage of the document, when it's in final draft, we do get questions. Can you do this? Can you rearrange this? So to, again, as much as we can plan forward, it really, really helps down the road. And the last bit I would like to mention is it's never too early to start thinking about data integration plans, because for any submission, integrated safety summary, most of the time require integration of databases across studies. So we do, sooner we can start thinking. And this is also really pays off when you have a large program. Studies with different sample size, different durations, different doses, different population. And often we also inherit studies from a previous program. So older the studies, it also adds to the complexity list. Last bit, keep an eye on the regulatory intelligence. What else, other approvals that happened, and even those that were not approved. What are the lessons learned? Next one, please. The other two things to keep an eye on, and these are input from partner companies as well as regulatory agencies. In my experience, this can be viewed both as a challenge sometimes as well as opportunities. I will start with the meetings and interaction with regulatory agencies. As we all know that we are only looking at one program, whereas the regulatory agencies, they are really exposed to everything, what all other sponsors are doing. So it's always useful to get the input early on in the process from the regulatory agencies to implement those changes in what our plans. And this happens with integration of database, integration of studies, data analysis plan, databases, the composition, format, content, everything. So really, it's critical, and I will strongly encourage everybody to make use of, communicating with agencies early on and as frequently as possible. The other piece is many of the programs we work on, it's often a co-development with another company or with another partner. So there could be, the sponsor is working on the US submission, but there is also a partner company that's working on the European submission. So we do need to, it helps to set the engagement rules in terms of review timelines and reviewing the data sets, programs, just to identify areas, because there may be certain areas that may require additional analysis to meet regional and country specifications. So engagement with partner companies and regulatory agencies always adds to it. It helps to plan ahead of time and make adjustments. Next one, please. So here I would like to share another case study, and this was a program that included many studies. It was a large program. It was 10 plus studies, and the studies were done at different times, controlled, uncontrolled. There were some that were ongoing, so we had to implement a cutoff date for the submission. There were different populations, and some of the studies were used also in a previous approval. So the point here is that this particular team, they made an effort and they met with FDA. And during this process, they really received valuable input from the agency. This input were regarding additional data pooling, to handle a specific disease type, as well as additional analysis pointers. For example, exposure-based safety analysis to, explore the relationship between dose and exposure, as there were many different doses and durations, and also some study-adjusted safety analysis. So this meeting really helped the team to get the input in real time and implement those changes in a timely manner. Next one, please. To sum it up, the key learnings, takeaways, just to put them together. The first piece is collaborate, coordinate, engage all stakeholders, to share knowledge, because no one knows everything, right? So more we put our heads together and more we collaborate, more, it will really help down the road. Dynamic planning. Planning is vital, planning is critical, but it's not static. So we just have to make sure, what we plan, we stay with the plan and be ready, be prepared to make adjustments to the plan as we go on. Next one. And last bit is keep an open communication with regulators and advisors. Really take advantage, to meet with them and to seek input from various regulators as well as, other companies. With that, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much. And I will now transfer to pass on to Mark.
Great, thanks, Anjana. So we are at the stage where the data is come in and it has everything we need and we can move quickly. And the first thing that we hear is that we need more outputs. So the dreaded post-hoc outputs get raised normally as soon as data comes out and people start going through it as a team. So really the way that we have to plan for that is to focus on the must-have post-hoc. So, things do come up like analyses that really are critical for the label, or as Anjana mentioned, a regulatory agency may have asked for a particular data output or analysis during a pre-submission meeting. those have to be addressed, and as well as sometimes a new safety signal that might come out, or it's at least a potential safety signal. So perhaps some additional analyses are needed. So those are all possible examples of must-haves where they really have to be taken into account. But most of the time, these analyses fall into that nice-to-have category of exploratory or prettier figures that show the data a little bit better. But in my experience, I think it really can take time and energy away from the team focusing on the data that they have and interpreting that and creating or refining their messages that they have. So that's something to always push back on a little bit to try and limit them as much as possible. Next slide. So when we're planning, there are a lot of components that Anjana was going through, and one way to really try to define the speed that you can go through this phase from database lock all the way to submission is what is the critical path. Some things will have to be done at risk, most likely, but if you plan it out in this way, where the first step usually after database lock would be the integrated outputs, those have to be planned for in advance, as Anjana said, because those are required, of course, for the summary of clinical safety and efficacy to really progress in any significant way with the data. So, if the summaries are actually put together with a detailed shell before that integrated data is out, then it can also go much faster. And then usually after that, or somewhere before module 2.5, are program-specific requirements or of documents. And I have a few listed here. It depends on the project. For a lot of small molecules, it tends to be a population PK or exposure response report. For some studies, especially in oncology, you can see narratives as being a big hurdle to get through the writing and review of all of those. So those have to be taken into account really to at least have everything drafted before you can get into the clinical overview. But one way to try and plan for a clinical overview to be efficiently put together is to focus on the messaging, not focus on re-presenting data or re-arguing why the data is acceptable and gives an optimal benefit risk, but the messaging, and then just reference the data that are in the other modules. And then last, of course, is the label, but that really needs to start early, and it should be developed all along the way of the other documents, because you really need that input from the label so that nothing gets missed. Because if you get to the label and some information isn't in one of these previous documents, then backtracking ends up happening. Okay, next slide. So when we get to the writing phase, how can we plan to streamline that process? Because writing and review, as we all know, can be slow and a lot of back and forth. And Anjana touched on one of them, and that is to get the medical writer involved early in the process, so that that writer for each of their documents knows the data and the outputs and what those outputs mean. In other words, even without the data, what was the purpose for generating those outputs in the first place? What do the populations mean? Which one to focus on? And then a detailed shell is also something that we talk about, but we often don't get nearly as detailed as we can. And by detailed, I mean all of the sections of a CSR or of a clinical summary really can be drafted just with the draft TFLs. And there should be some thought in advance of what outputs should be in text and which don't need to be in text. So then the next thing that can be planned for is to write from draft TFLs. It's rare that we can wait for the final TFLs, but one way to speed this is to keep that last CSR, or if there's several going at the end, keep them focused on lean text. Don't put a lot of messaging in the CSR or interpretation. That can be put in the discussion of the CSR, but throughout the body, that should be minimized, and it will go much more quickly. And then in the third bullet, the third box, we are often writing CSRs and summaries in parallel, not linearly. And one way to improve the efficiency there is to have a collaborative writing platform. So multiple authors can be in a document at the same time, and the CSR can be focused on the data, and the summaries can focus on the messages. And then the summaries can just reference most of the data and just pull in the critical pieces that are needed. And then the last piece is with the overview and the label. One thing that has to be brought in early are the commercial colleagues and their input, their needs for the label. And the annotation of the label, of course, has to happen toward the end, but all along, it needs to be kept track of as to where all the data is coming from. So it's not a backward search for all of the sources of everything when you get to the very end, because that will take some time. So the next slide is you may have noticed in Steve's earlier slide, the bar all the way over to the right of a submission that took almost a year to complete. So I wanted to just bring to bear some of what Anjana and I have both talked about as to what can speed along a submission, at least certain phases, and what may slow it down. So for this example, there were some parts that went right. And on the right side here, I've compared in the blue bars this submission to the mean that Steve showed for each phase of the orange, which is the orange bars. So for this team, the database lock to the draft TFLs, that went well. That was right about at the mean, only a few weeks. All the way at the end, that also went well. So the pre-submission meeting to the actual submission and the last document to submission, timing, those were all right at the mean as well. But where it fell apart, or slowed down, I should say, was the first one. Here is the draft TFLs to the pooled TFLs. So this one is what I've seen happen a few times, not just in this case, where really the planning for the pooled outputs wasn't complete. There was talk, there was planning, but it just, the programs weren't in place. They weren't the programs weren't totally tested. So it just really slowed everything down to get that pooled output. And then the other thing that slowed it down is the draft TFLs to that last document. And this was a case of lots and lots of rework, wordsmithing, more drafts, 5 drafts, 6 drafts, and it just really, you can see the effect of it, and it basically doubled the time up into the range of 300 days for that activity. So that's what can happen if it gets out of control in these steps. Next slide. So just a few points on how to really improve efficiency. Commitment is really one of them that is critical, and it's commitment from the top down, because if the upper management is not on board with the messages and the way things are presented, they can derail it without really meaning to necessarily right toward the end. So they have to be brought in and be agreeing all along the way. Timelines, I think we all think about, of course, in terms of making it quicker, but staggering reviews is a critical one, because the team is often a limiting factor. There's only so many team members, and they can't review 2 or 3 documents all at the same time, usually. So we need to stagger reviews as best we can. The other thing that, or another thing that we need to think about are the competing priorities. Steve mentioned this, but on the team, at least, many people do work on other programs or have other responsibilities even for that program, like, for example, an IB update. And then last is the unexpected. You have to really expect the unexpected. You may not know what will come up, but you have to be flexible, expect some delays, or expect that some rework or corrections will have to happen, and you just have to be ready for them and know what to do when things like that pop up, and have a plan for how to address them. Next slide. And then the last mile, something that we often get squeezed, and we need to try to do the best we can so that the publishing is happening all along the way of the other processes. So you have to start early, and you have to plan your content and your tracker. So basically all of the documents that are going to be in the submission, you have to plan for and have a way to track them and start publishing early. As soon as documents are ready, start publishing. They may not be able to go all the way through the publishing because documents can't be finished until sources are available, but they can be all taken as far as they can, and then when sources are available, they can then take that last step. Another one that's key is file control, especially when we're working with documents for medical writing. We have to have a way to control those final published documents. So we have to communicate that approved files for publishing means that there's no changes, no further changes. They're done. They move on, and those are in a separate location usually. Is the way to set that up. And then another way that we have learned to speed along publishing is to separate it into 2 parts. One is the document level publishing, and the second is the submission level publishing or regulatory operations. But really key to that is communication and handoff. That has to be seamless, and it has to be constant, and usually the way to start with it, at least, is with the tracker, so that everybody knows exactly where a document is and when it's ready for the next step. And then the last piece that we can't forget, and we have to plan for it before this all starts, is that these documents need to be reviewed and approved by the experts, so the SMEs, subject matter experts. So they need to know how to do that and what's expected of them. And we need to have a communication system so that they know what's available, when it's available, and they can communicate what the issues are or what needs to be corrected. So again, sort of a tracker needs to be put in place in advance for communicating those issues. So that's it for me, and I'll hand it back to Steve to wrap up.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Anjana. So one last slide to kind of tie together some of what we've presented. A few best practice points, ways to help you keep from getting stuck in your planning or in your key period from database lock to actual submission. So one is adding experience. So everybody does submissions for the first time, and you're never going to have a team that everybody has been through a submission before, but it is helpful to know what done looks like. And so if you're able to, if you have a team that has limited submission experience, it's good to try to bring in folks who have been through that process and know what done looks like. As Mark just touched on, staggering activities, we see an awful lot of having to write pivotal study reports in parallel with summary documents. We try to schedule and lay out timelines to avoid that as much as possible and to limit authoring from draft data. But a lot of things have to happen in parallel. And so we try to stagger things as much as we can. Increase engagement. We've talked a lot about bringing in management early, bringing in all of the different functions that might be involved or have a hand in it. We all know how frustrating it can be to have someone new come in on a review at the very end and have significant input that may be really good, but is difficult to handle at that late stage. Confronting gaps and weaknesses. So we touched on it early on, looking at the regulatory history and the interactions, and then evaluating the data as it comes in. It's critical to keep from getting derailed to ensure that you actually confront those. Teams can spend a lot of time spinning on issues, kind of trying to avoid them or talk around them. And it's always best to get right in there and say, here's what it is, and here's why we think it's a problem or not a problem. Of course, create comprehensive timelines. This means getting down to the day. If you create a timeline that requires everyone to work on the weekends and holidays, then that's what will happen. So try to create your timeline in a way that doesn't require that. You may find yourself in a situation where you then have to, but at least you didn't set it up so it was predetermined. And don't revisit decisions. This is something where keeping a decision log and meeting minutes can help. It's one of the biggest frustrations to teams to have to change something and then change it back. And overall, our whole message, our key message, if you walk away with only one thing from today, is that to go faster from that last database lock to submission is something you achieve in planning prior to that database lock, not after that has occurred. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and thanks again to Anjana and Mark. And we'll open it up for questions.
So Steve, I think we do have one question you might want to answer. That the question is, are there rules for cutoff dates for ongoing studies when submitting?
Yes and no. So I think the expectation is if you have an ongoing study, whether it's blinded or unblinded, that you don't have to have fully cleaned the data, but you do need to report any deaths or SAEs that have occurred. I think the key cutoff date point is really around, let's say your phase 3 study, which was your last data cut, happened December 31st, and you're submitting the end of June, and you have studies ongoing. You might pick a cutoff date that's closer to submission than December 31st, because that'll be 6 months prior to submission by the time you submit. So perhaps you build your timeline to accommodate a March 31st data cutoff. And again, it can be a very simple download from the safety database rather than from the clinical database to just account for deaths and SAEs. All right, see, we have another question around technology using for trackers. So there's a few different types of trackers we use. We've been using smart sheet for timelines with some assists from Excel, and then a large Excel template we use for our content plans and submission tracking to track all of the files. I see another question here. So the question is, if I understand correctly, it takes a year to build an NDA. There is 1 year review afterwards for a total of 2 years. Are there strategies to shorten the timeline? Yeah, I think that 1 year, obviously there are a number of factors that can influence this. Some of the examples we mentioned about if the rate limiting step is not a phase 3, the rate limiting step is not a phase 3 database lock. It's a thorough QT study or drug-drug interaction study. You'd still want to be planning your submission a year in advance, but those last steps might be quicker. The review period, obviously can be shortened if it's a priority review or an accelerated approval, something along those lines. But in terms of overall shortening the planning period, I think one of the things you run into there is getting people to really sit down and think hard about and work out some of those plans ahead of time. And that's where competing priorities often come in. I don't know, Mark or Anjana, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would agree with that. It's getting the team to engage in advance is part of the trick.
And just to add to that, also a lot of the work happening, as during the study conduct. So it's not completely, especially the preparation time. It's really happening in parallel with as the study is ongoing.
I see another question here around would it be worth retaining services of a third party for a mock audit? Yes, we haven't really touched on, and I didn't mention that occasionally there are submissions where CMC, like 12-month stability data or non-clinical, might be rate limiting. I think we've all seen a handful of those. We've just focused today's presentation on when clinical is rate limiting, because that's probably 90% of submissions. But retaining a third party for a mock audit. So absolutely, yeah. If you're expecting an audit on site or a manufacturing facility or a study site, yeah, there's a lot of value in conducting your own mock audit or bringing in a third party to assist with that. All right, I think we have time for another question or so.
Yeah, I do see there's 2 more there, Steve. One on outsourcing. So what needs to be outsourced except publishing and validation? I think that one definitely depends on the resources that are available in your company. But I think a lot of times you do see where the in-house staff, whether it's medical writing or biostatistics, as 2 examples, just are busy with all the study level work. So they just don't have the bandwidth for a submission. So those pieces, I think, often are outsourced. And sometimes also some regulatory advice, basically, especially if you're going to a region that you're not really familiar with. You often will need a regulatory consultant that knows that region.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Mark. I hadn't scrolled down all the way on the questions.
Okay.
So I see another question around separate team managing reference publications. It doesn't have to be a separate team, but you probably want one individual responsible for coordinating that. And the key point there is acquiring copyright permissions for the copies of any publications you reference and getting agreement in your team about which references you're going to include. So whether you're including copies of only references cited in summary documents versus taking that, applying that rule all the way back to the underlying source study reports. Question about how to integrate and manage consultants' inputs. The key there, I think, is just planning for it. So the times I've seen teams run into trouble is where they suddenly decide, as they're in a final draft of the last documents, that they need some key opinion leader or consulting input, and go out to get that. And those people are coming in at the last minute. They haven't seen what the team's thinking. The team may not have had opportunity to talk through that with them. And there's a big potential for disconnects on messaging. So I think if you want to bring in key opinion leaders or consultants, to do so earlier rather than later, and have the team aligned on, your own internal team aligned on kind of how you're going to approach the comments, and go into it being very clear internally and with the consultant about whether you're going to say no if they ask for something that you don't agree with or don't want to do, and how you're going to manage that. Right, see, we have one for critical period from draft TFLs to final TFLs. Do you have recommendations on holding data review meetings?
I can do that.
I was going to say, I think all of us probably have some pretty strong views on that. So, Anjana, yeah, if you want to handle that.
Sure, thank you. So really the data review meeting should happen before draft TFLs, it's before lock, right? And I will recommend, fitting in as many as possible, probably, on a monthly basis or on a bi-weekly basis. Depends on the frequency, depends really the speed with which the study, is ongoing. So if there is a lot happening, then we can do it, then it can be done more frequently. Otherwise, you can just do it at a monthly interval.
Excellent. Yeah, I think one other thing I'd add there is avoiding going through every output in a data review meeting. Have people review them, provide comments on titles, footnotes, other things, so you can focus on, make that review meeting. What's the message, the takeaway from this table or this figure? All right, let's see. Mark is typing an answer.
I am typing the answer. But it's really just about the tracking. How do we track
the submission?
Yeah, the submission. And it's, as Steve said, Smartsheet is what we use for timelines, but for the actual publishing documents and where they are and when their publishers are expecting them, that we use a very customized Excel sheet with macros and reporting features in it, so that you can see at a glance how many documents are expected still, which modules they're in, how many pages are still outstanding. It's been customized over many years, actually.
Excellent. And then see, we're a few minutes over. If it's okay to keep going with this, I don't know, Alex, if we make this our last question.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more, and then we'll close it down. Let's see. For those that have to drop off, I will put the completion code in the chat for, right now, but otherwise I will let you answer this last one.
Okay. So have one here, and maybe Mark, if you want to address it, it's around streamlining writing process. So writing from draft TFLs and writing CSR and summary documents in parallel, but then we're also making the point about that it's best not to write from draft data if you can, and to stagger those documents. So that you
yeah, this is why it's hard.
yeah.
Yeah, so I think the reality is we sort of have to write from draft TFLs, but there's two things that I strongly recommend. One is that your biometrics colleagues look at them first and make sure that they're of high enough quality that they are worth or reasonable to use. And the second is we really wait on QCing numbers in text and in text tables back to those TFLs until they're final. So we write with them, make conclusions, et cetera, but we do not do the QC back to the sources until they're final, which typically is obviously near the end. But yeah, and that's fine. But the biometrics folks have to make sure that those outputs are accurate, at least as best they can tell, right? There's always a few things. And then, sort of the last piece is usually when updates are made to TFLs, we try to get the either a track change or some indication of what has actually been changed in those outputs.
Excellent. All right. With that, Alex, will turn it over to you to close. Thank you again, Mark and Anjana, and thank you all for participating today.